In the quiet hills of Tennessee, 1981, what should have been an ordinary Sunday morning at First Baptist Church of Cedar Creek became the beginning of a community crisis that no one saw coming. The Perkins family had been pillars of this small rural congregation for nearly 60 years. Their dedication, donations, and devotion had helped build the very walls of the sanctuary they called home. But on this particular rally day, a simple seating arrangement would expose deep fractures that had been silently growing beneath the surface of this tight-knit community. What started as a matter of church tradition quickly spiraled into something much darker, revealing how pride, territory, and unspoken rivalries can transform even the most sacred spaces into battlegrounds. This is the true story of how a family's sense of ownership, a community's struggle with change, and the weight of decades-old traditions collided in ways that would leave lasting scars on everyone involved. If you're ready to dive into this incredible tale of human nature, community dynamics, and the dangerous power of unresolved conflict, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more amazing true stories, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this story goes. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Hawkins County like a whispered prayer, soft and ethereal in the pale Tennessee dawn. September 27, 1981, would be remembered as the Sunday that changed everything, though nobody in Cedar Creek could have imagined it as they prepared for worship that quiet autumn morning. The First Baptist Church of Cedar Creek sat like a weathered sentinel on Main Street, its white clapboard walls and simple bell tower a testament to the enduring faith of this rural community. Built in 1923 with the sweat and donations of farming families, the church had weathered the Great Depression, 2 wars, and countless seasons of drought and plenty. Its pews had witnessed baptisms, weddings, funerals, and the quiet Sunday rituals that bound this community of 300 souls together. For 58 years, the Perkins family had occupied the same pew, 3rd row from the front, right side, beneath the stained glass window depicting Jesus blessing the children. It wasn't officially their pew, of course. No brass nameplate marked it as such. But in the unspoken traditions of small-town congregations, certain understandings held the weight of Scripture itself. The Harringtons always sat in the back left corner. The widow Morrison claimed the front row, center, and the Perkins clan, all 14 members across 3 generations, filled that 3rd row pew like they had staked their claim to a piece of heaven itself. James Robert Perkins, patriarch of the family at 73, had first sat in that pew as a boy in 1923, holding his mother's calloused hand while his father counted offering money with the solemnity of a sacred duty. James had courted his wife Martha in that pew, whispering sweet promises during long sermons about hellfire and redemption. He had wept in that pew when their firstborn son died of pneumonia in the harsh winter of 1949. He had celebrated in that same spot when their remaining children, Robert, Samuel, and Sarah, grew up to fill the pew with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The Perkins were not just churchgoers, they were pillars. James had served as deacon for 27 years. His wife Martha organized every church supper, every Christmas pageant, every funeral meal. Their children had been Sunday school teachers, choir members, and youth group leaders. The family had donated lumber for the church's expansion in 1965, paid for new hymnals in 1975, and contributed more to the building fund than any other family in the congregation's history. But success in farming and devotion to God had not softened the Perkins temperament. 3 generations of working the same stubborn Tennessee soil had bred a family known for their pride, their work ethic, and their unwillingness to back down from any challenge, perceived or real. James Perkins was a man who measured respect in inches and remembered slights for decades. His sons had inherited that rigid backbone, that sense of righteous indignation that could flare from simmer to boiling in heartbeats. The church had grown over the years. New families had moved to Cedar Creek as the nearby county seat expanded. Young couples bought small farms or found work at the new factory 20 miles south. Pastor William Henderson, a gentleman in his 50s, who had led the congregation for 8 years, welcomed each newcomer with genuine warmth. He believed deeply that God's house had room for all, that the church should reflect the growing diversity of their changing community. But growth brought challenges that the pastor's seminary training hadn't fully prepared him for. The delicate balance of a small church, where every family had their unspoken territories, their traditional roles, their assumed privileges, began to shift as new faces filled the pews. Long-time members felt their influence diluting. Newer families sometimes unknowingly violated customs that had never been written down but had governed church life for decades. The Daniels family had moved to Cedar Creek just 6 months ago. Michael Daniels, a soft-spoken accountant, had taken a position at the county courthouse. His wife, Susan, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school, and their twin boys, 8 years old, charmed everyone with their gap-toothed grins and endless energy during children's church. They were exactly the kind of young family that Pastor Henderson hoped would help the congregation grow and thrive. The Daniels had been attending faithfully every Sunday since March, gradually finding their place in the community. Susan had joined the Ladies' Auxiliary. Michael had volunteered to help with the church's financial records, a gesture that should have been welcomed, but somehow rubbed James Perkins the wrong way. The old deacon muttered to his sons that outsiders shouldn't be handling church business until they'd proven themselves worthy of such trust. 37 years I've been managing these books, James had complained to his son Robert just the week before. Never had a penny go missing, never had a mistake in the ledger. Now this city boy thinks he can waltz in and take over what I've been doing since before he was born. The tensions had been building through small incidents all summer. The Daniels boys had been too loud during prayer time. Susan had suggested changes to the church supper menu that differed from Martha Perkins' 40-year tradition. Michael had questioned, politely, respectfully, some of the financial procedures during a deacon's meeting, wondering if the church might benefit from a more modern bookkeeping system. Each perceived slight was filed away in the Perkins family's collective memory, building like pressure in a kettle with no release valve. They whispered among themselves at family dinners about the new people who didn't understand how things were done around here. They complained that Pastor Henderson was too eager to accommodate newcomers at the expense of families who had kept the church alive through hard times. But it wasn't just the Daniels family that had unsettled the established order. The Marshalls, the Carters, the Townsends, all recent arrivals to Cedar Creek, had begun to form their own informal network within the congregation. They socialized together, their children played together, and they sometimes sat together during worship, taking up pews that had previously been occupied by long-time families, or left empty, in deference to tradition. The morning of September 27th dawned crisp and clear, with the first hint of autumn color touching the maple trees that lined the church's gravel parking lot. Martha Perkins had been up since 5 o'clock, preparing her famous cornbread for the fellowship lunch that would follow the service. It was Rally Day, an annual celebration marking the beginning of the church's fall programming, and the entire community would gather for worship, food, and the kind of socializing that reinforced the bonds holding their small town together. James Perkins, dressed with the careful precision of a man who understood that appearance mattered, especially in church. His Sunday suit, though 20 years old, was pressed to perfection. His shoes gleamed with fresh polish. His silver hair was combed with the same attention to detail he brought to everything in his life. At 73, he moved with the careful dignity of a man who had earned respect through decades of hard work and community service. The Perkins family had always arrived early for Sunday service, not out of extra piety, but because James believed that punctuality was a virtue and that their family deserved time to settle into their traditional pew without rush or disturbance. By 9:45, 15 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin, the entire Perkins clan was ready to make their customary entrance into God's house. Robert Perkins, James's eldest son at 46, loaded his own family into his pickup truck while his father and mother climbed into the family's well-maintained Buick sedan. Samuel, 43, gathered his wife and teenage children into their Ford wagon. Sarah, now Sarah Coleman after her marriage 15 years ago, lived just down the road with her husband David and their 3 young children. The 4-vehicle convoy moved slowly down Cedar Creek's main street, past the general store, the post office, and the handful of houses that constituted the town's commercial center. It was a drive they had made thousands of times, a ritual as comfortable and familiar as breathing itself. But as they turned into the church parking lot, James Perkins felt the first stirring of unease in his chest. The lot was fuller than usual. Rally Day always brought out occasional attendees and visitors, but there was something about the arrangement of cars that seemed wrong, though he couldn't immediately identify what troubled him. Inside the sanctuary, Pastor Henderson was making final preparations for what he hoped would be a celebration of community growth and renewed spiritual commitment. The church looked beautiful, decorated with fall flowers that the ladies' auxiliary had arranged the previous afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn wooden floors. The atmosphere should have been perfect for worship and fellowship, but even Pastor Henderson sensed the undercurrent of tension that had been building in his congregation over recent months. He had noticed the way certain families clustered together, the way conversations sometimes stopped when he approached, the subtle signs that not everyone was entirely happy with the changes that growth had brought to their small church family. As the Perkins family approached the sanctuary doors, James's steps slowed. Through the glass, he could see that their pew, their sacred third row, right side, was occupied by strangers. The Daniels family sat where the Perkins had sat for nearly 60 years, their twin boys swinging their legs and looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity of children still learning church etiquette. The sight hit James Perkins like a physical blow. In all his years of worship, through sickness and health, through conflicts and reconciliations, that pew had been their anchor, their rightful place in the house of God. To see it occupied by newcomers felt like a violation of something sacred, something that went beyond mere seating arrangements to the very heart of belonging, tradition, and respect. Martha Perkins noticed her husband's sudden stillness and followed his gaze into the sanctuary. She drew in a sharp breath when she saw their pew occupied by the Daniels family. Behind them, Robert, Samuel, and Sarah gathered with their own families, quickly recognizing the source of their father's distress. "Dad?" Robert asked quietly, his own jaw tightening as he took in the scene. "What do we do?" James Perkins stood in the doorway of the church, his Sunday best suddenly feeling like armor, his mind racing through decades of unwritten rules and sacred traditions that these newcomers had unknowingly violated. The organ music drifted through the sanctuary, calling the faithful to worship, but all James could see was his family's rightful place occupied by people who couldn't understand what that pew meant to the Perkins legacy. The moment stretched like eternity, heavy with possibility and consequence, as 3 generations of Perkins stood at the threshold of their church home, faced with a choice that would define not just this Sunday morning, but the future of their entire community. The Perkins family stood frozen in the church doorway, a tableau of disbelief and rising indignation. James felt his carefully controlled world tilting on its axis as he watched 8-year-old Tommy Daniels swing his legs from what had been James's childhood seat, the boy's scuffed sneakers barely reaching the floor where 3 generations of Perkins' feet had rested during decades of worship. Pastor Henderson, still arranging his sermon notes at the pulpit, glanced up and immediately sensed the tension radiating from the church entrance. The Perkins family's usual punctual arrival had become an awkward standstill, and other congregation members were beginning to notice the unusual delay. Whispered conversations started among the early arrivals as people craned their necks to see what had caused the disruption. Martha Perkins placed a gentle but firm hand on her husband's arm, feeling the tremor of anger that ran through his rigid frame. In 52 years of marriage, she had learned to read the signs of James's temper like a farmer reading storm clouds. The tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw worked silently, the slight forward lean of his shoulders, all indicated a man approaching the limits of his considerable self-control. "James," she whispered, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had managed family crises for half a century. "Remember where we are." But James Perkins was remembering exactly where he was, in the house of God that his family had helped build, maintain, and sustain through every challenge the community had faced. This wasn't just about a wooden bench. It was about respect, recognition, and the rightful order of things that had served Cedar Creek well for decades. Robert Perkins stepped closer to his father, his own family crowding behind him in the narrow doorway. At 46, Robert had inherited his father's strong will and his mother's practical sense, but today the practical side was losing ground rapidly. His son Michael, 16 and eager to impress his grandfather, spoke first. "Grandad, you want me to go ask them to move?" The teenager's voice carried the confidence of youth that saw complex problems as having simple solutions. "Hush, boy," Robert said sharply, but his tone betrayed his own conflicted feelings. Part of him wanted to march down that aisle and reclaim their family's rightful place through sheer force of presence and tradition. Another part recognized that such a confrontation in the sanctuary would violate everything they claimed to believe about Christian behavior. Samuel Perkins, the middle son, had always been the family diplomat. At 43, he managed the delicate relationships between their farm and neighboring properties, handled disputes with suppliers, and generally served as the family's representative in situations requiring tact. But even Samuel felt his patience wearing thin as he watched the Daniels family settle more comfortably into seats that held decades of Perkins family history. "Maybe we should sit somewhere else today," Samuel suggested quietly. "Just this once. We could talk to Pastor Henderson after service about the situation." The suggestion hit James like a slap. Retreat, compromise, except that newcomers could simply claim what the Perkins family had earned through generations of loyalty and service. The very idea violated every principle that had guided his 73 years of life. Sarah Coleman, the only daughter and often the voice of reason in family disputes, found herself torn between loyalty to her father and embarrassment at the scene they were creating. Her own children, ages 6, 9, and 12, were beginning to fidget and ask questions that she couldn't answer without acknowledging the depth of adult pettiness they were witnessing. "Mama, why aren't we going in?" her 9-year-old daughter whispered loudly enough for several nearby families to hear. The question hung in the air like an accusation, forcing the adult Perkins to confront how their behavior might appear to innocent eyes. But James remained fixed on what he saw as a fundamental violation of church tradition and family honor. Inside the sanctuary, Michael Daniels was beginning to sense something amiss. He had noticed the large family gathered at the entrance, seemingly reluctant to enter, and he recognized them as the prominent Perkins clan that everyone in Cedar Creek knew by reputation, if not personal acquaintance. As an accountant, Michael had a naturally observant mind, and the pattern of their hesitation suggested more than casual delay. Susan Daniels was helping her sons find the correct page in their hymnals when she felt her husband's subtle touch on her arm. Following his gaze toward the entrance, she saw the cluster of people whose body language suggested tension rather than typical pre-service socialization. "Should we ask if everything's all right?" Susan whispered to her husband, her teacher's instincts always alert to situations where help might be needed. Michael was about to respond when Pastor Henderson made his own decision to address the obvious problem. The minister had served churches for 23 years, including 2 previous congregations that had faced similar growing pains as established families struggled to accommodate newcomers. He recognized the signs of territorial conflict that could poison a church's atmosphere, if not handled with immediate pastoral care. Walking down the center aisle with the measured steps of a man approaching a delicate situation, Pastor Henderson approached the Perkins family with a warm smile that didn't entirely mask his concern. "Good morning, James, Martha," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "Wonderful to see you all here for Rally Day. Is everything all right?" The pastor's direct attention forced James to make a choice. He could either explain his grievance publicly, creating an unmistakably uncomfortable scene, or he could find some way to navigate the situation without losing face or abandoning his principles. "Pastor Henderson," James replied, his voice carrying the controlled courtesy of a man fighting to maintain his dignity. "We seem to have a small seating situation this morning." The euphemism hung between them, both men understanding exactly what wasn't being said directly. Pastor Henderson glanced back at the sanctuary, quickly identifying the occupied pew that had caused the standstill, and immediately grasped the full scope of the problem he was facing. In his 8 years at First Baptist of Cedar Creek, Pastor Henderson had learned that the unofficial seating arrangements represented more than mere habit. They were visible expressions of hierarchy, belonging, and family identity that had evolved over decades. Disrupting these patterns, even innocently, could trigger conflicts that went far beyond the immediate issue. "I see," Pastor Henderson said carefully. "Perhaps we could find seats together where everyone would be comfortable." The suggestion was reasonable, diplomatic, and completely unacceptable to James Perkins. The pastor's willingness to treat this as a minor accommodation problem rather than a serious breach of church tradition only confirmed James's growing suspicion that Pastor Henderson didn't truly understand or respect the foundations upon which Cedar Creek's church community had been built. "That pew has been occupied by my family for 58 years, James said, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts at control. "My grandmother embroidered the cushions that are still there. My father donated the wood for those seats when the church was expanded. 3 generations of my family have worshipped in that exact spot." The words carried across the sanctuary with greater force than James had intended. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. The Daniels family couldn't help but overhear, and the realization that they had unknowingly triggered this confrontation began to dawn on them with uncomfortable clarity. Pastor Henderson felt the weight of every eye in the sanctuary as he stood between the immovable force of Perkins tradition and the growing embarrassment of a family that had committed no intentional wrongdoing. His next words would either diffuse the situation or escalate it beyond easy repair. "James, I understand completely how important that pew is to your family," Pastor Henderson said, raising his voice slightly so that everyone could hear his response. "Your family's contributions to this church are immeasurable, and that will never change regardless of where anyone sits." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. By emphasizing that seating didn't matter, Pastor Henderson had inadvertently dismissed the very thing that mattered most to James Perkins, the tangible, visible recognition of his family's place in the church hierarchy. Michael Daniels, overhearing enough of the conversation to understand the situation, stood up in the disputed pew. His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized his family had become the center of a church conflict they never intended to create. "I'm so sorry," Michael called out, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent sanctuary. "We didn't realize. We can certainly move, we're just happy to be here." The offer to relocate should have solved the problem immediately. It was gracious, appropriate, and exactly what James Perkins had wanted 5 minutes earlier. But now, with the entire congregation watching and Pastor Henderson's implied criticism hanging in the air, simple capitulation felt like public humiliation rather than victory. James found himself trapped between his desire to reclaim his family's pew and his reluctance to appear tyrannical in front of the entire church community. Accepting the Daniels family's offer to move would confirm that he had been unreasonable to make an issue of seating arrangements in the first place. Declining their offer would make him appear ungracious and unwelcoming. Martha Perkins recognized her husband's dilemma and the potential for this situation to spiral completely out of control. With the wisdom of a woman who had managed family and community relationships for decades, she made her own decision. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Daniels," Martha said, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "But families should sit together, and you're already settled. We'll find seats where we can all be comfortable." It was a masterful compromise that preserved everyone's dignity while avoiding immediate confrontation. But James Perkins heard his wife's diplomatic solution as surrender, and something deep in his chest tightened with a mixture of frustration, embarrassment, and betrayed expectations. The Perkins family filed into available seats scattered throughout the sanctuary. Robert's family in the 5th row left, Samuel's family toward the back, James and Martha in the 2nd row right side. For the first time in nearly 6 decades, the Perkins clan was scattered, separated, diminished in their visible presence and unified authority. As Pastor Henderson returned to his pulpit and called the congregation to worship, James Perkins sat in an unfamiliar pew, his carefully ordered world feeling fundamentally altered by something as simple as where people chose to sit in church. But in his mind, it wasn't simple at all. It was the beginning of everything he feared about change, progress, and the gradual erosion of the values and traditions that had made Cedar Creek the kind of community worth preserving. The organ music began, voices joined in familiar hymns, and worship proceeded as it had for decades. But underneath the surface of normal Sunday morning ritual, new tensions had been exposed that would prove far more difficult to resolve than anyone could have imagined. The hymn Amazing Grace had never sounded so discordant to James Perkins. As the congregation sang the familiar words about redemption and forgiveness, James sat rigidly in the unfamiliar second-row pew, his weathered hands gripping the hymnal with white-knuckled intensity. Every note felt like a mockery of the morning's events, every verse about grace a reminder of how little grace had been shown to his family's decades of faithful service. Pastor Henderson's Rally Day sermon focused on community growth and welcoming strangers, themes that under different circumstances might have resonated with James's Christian beliefs. But today, each reference to embracing newcomers felt like a personal rebuke. Each call for flexibility and change another nail in the coffin of everything James held sacred about church tradition. "We must remember," Pastor Henderson proclaimed from the pulpit, his voice carrying the measured cadence of careful preparation, "that our Lord Jesus himself said, 'In my Father's house are many rooms.' There is space for everyone at God's table, room for all in God's family." The words that were meant to heal only deepened James's sense of betrayal. In his mind, the issue had never been about excluding anyone from God's house. It had been about respecting the established order that had allowed the church to function harmoniously for generations. The pastor's emphasis on inclusion seemed to dismiss the value of tradition, stability, and the earned recognition that longtime members deserved. Martha Perkins noticed her husband's increasing agitation and gently placed her hand over his clenched fist. But even her calming presence couldn't ease the growing storm of emotions that the morning's events had unleashed. James felt as though he was witnessing the systematic dismantling of everything he had spent his life building and protecting. Behind them, scattered throughout the sanctuary, the extended Perkins family shared their patriarch's discomfort. Robert caught his father's eye during the responsive reading and saw his own frustration reflected in the older man's grim expression. Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his back row seat, feeling physically and symbolically distanced from his accustomed place of prominence. Sarah, sitting with her young children in an unfamiliar pew, struggled to maintain her composure while answering their whispered questions about why the family wasn't sitting together. The Daniels family, meanwhile, sat in increasingly uncomfortable awareness of the tension their presence had created. Michael found it impossible to focus on Pastor Henderson's words as he replayed the morning's confrontation, wondering if there had been some way to avoid the entire situation. Susan noticed other congregation members glancing between their family and the displaced Perkins clan, clearly uncomfortable with the drama that had disrupted their peaceful Sunday morning. 8-year-old Tommy Daniels, oblivious to the adult complexities surrounding him, continued to swing his legs from the contested pew, his innocent movements a constant reminder to James of everything that had gone wrong. Each creak of the wooden bench felt amplified in James's ears, each sound a violation of the sacred space that had once been exclusively his family's domain. As the service progressed through familiar liturgical elements, prayer requests, offering collection, choir anthem, the underlying tensions only grew more pronounced. When it came time for the weekly announcements, Pastor Henderson made what he undoubtedly intended as a gesture of reconciliation. "Before we move to our fellowship lunch," the pastor announced, "I want to take a moment to recognize the Perkins family, whose faithful service and generous support have been cornerstones of our church for nearly 60 years. James and Martha, Robert, Samuel, and Sarah, your dedication has helped make this church the welcoming home it is today." The recognition should have been gratifying, but delivered in the context of the morning's conflict, it felt to James like a consolation prize, acknowledgement of past contributions coupled with implicit dismissal of current concerns. The polite applause from the congregation seemed hollow, dutiful rather than heartfelt, and James wondered how many people were simply eager to move past the uncomfortable scene they had all witnessed. When the service finally concluded with the benediction, the traditional post-worship socializing began with an undercurrent of awkwardness that permeated every conversation. Church members who normally would have greeted the Perkins family with casual warmth now approached with careful, overly polite inquiries about how everyone was doing, the kind of solicitous concern reserved for those experiencing some form of misfortune. Eleanor Hartwell, the church organist for 32 years and one of Martha's closest friends, approached with the delicate steps of someone navigating a potential minefield. "Martha, dear," Eleanor said, her voice pitched low to avoid attracting attention. I hope you know that many of us understand how difficult this morning must have been. Some traditions should be respected. The sympathy, while well-intentioned, only served to confirm Martha's worst fears about how the incident would be perceived and discussed throughout the community. She had spent decades building a reputation as a gracious, diplomatic woman who could handle any social situation with proper Christian charity. The thought that she was now the object of pity or sympathy felt almost worse than the original seating dispute. "Thank you, Eleanor," Martha replied with forced brightness. "But I'm sure everything will work itself out. These things usually do." But even as she spoke the words, Martha questioned whether she truly believed them. The morning's events had revealed fault lines in their church community that she hadn't previously recognized. Divisions between old and new, traditional and progressive, that might prove more difficult to bridge than anyone wanted to acknowledge. James, meanwhile, found himself surrounded by male church members whose expressions of support carried their own complicated messages. Deacon Harold Morrison, a contemporary who had served alongside James for over 20 years, shook his head sympathetically. "Don't know what this world is coming to," Harold muttered, "when people can't respect what's always been. Your family built this place, James. That ought to count for something." The validation felt good in the moment, but it also troubled James in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Was he simply an old man clinging to outdated traditions, or was he defending principles that still mattered? The question gnawed at him as he accepted similar expressions of support from other long-time members. Robert Perkins gathered his immediate family and approached his father with barely controlled anger evident in every line of his body. At 46, Robert had inherited his father's strong will, but lacked the older man's decades of experience in managing community relationships. "Dad, we can't let this stand," Robert said, his voice low but intense. "If we don't do something, every newcomer in town will think they can just walk in and take over whatever they want. This is about more than seating. It's about respect." James appreciated his son's loyalty, but Robert's suggestion of direct action troubled him. What exactly did not letting this stand mean in the context of a church community? What actions could they take that wouldn't ultimately damage the Perkins family's reputation more than the morning's incident already had? Samuel, ever the diplomat, joined his father and brother with a different perspective. "Maybe we should give it some time," he suggested. "Let things settle down. Talk to Pastor Henderson privately about establishing some kind of understanding about traditional seating arrangements." But time wasn't healing James's wounds. It was allowing them to fester. Each minute that passed since the morning's humiliation felt like another small defeat, another step toward the complete erosion of everything he had spent his life building. Sarah approached her father with her characteristic directness, though her voice carried the strain of managing her own family's confusion about the morning's events. "Daddy," she said, using the childhood name that still came naturally in moments of stress, "my children are asking questions I don't know how to answer. They want to know why we're angry at the new family, why we couldn't sit in our regular seats, why church felt different today." The innocent questions of grandchildren cut deeper than any adult criticism could have. James had always prided himself on being the kind of grandfather who set a positive example, who demonstrated Christian values through his actions rather than just his words. The thought that his behavior might have confused or upset his grandchildren added another layer of complexity to his already turbulent emotions. Across the fellowship hall, where tables laden with traditional church supper foods awaited the congregation, the Daniels family stood in their own circle of awkward isolation. Well-meaning church members approached them with carefully worded expressions of welcome that couldn't quite mask the underlying message that they had somehow transgressed against unwritten rules they couldn't have known existed. "Don't you worry about this morning," said Betty Richardson, a middle-aged woman who taught Sunday school. "Every church has its little traditions, but you'll fit in just fine once everyone gets used to having you here." The reassurance, however kindly intended, emphasized that the Daniels family was still considered outsiders who needed to earn acceptance rather than full members of the church community. Michael Daniels found himself wondering whether moving to Cedar Creek had been a mistake, whether small-town church life came with social complications that his urban background hadn't prepared him to navigate. Pastor Henderson moved through the fellowship hall with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing post-service social dynamics, but even his experienced eye could see that the morning's incident had created divisions that simple time and good intentions might not be able to heal. Long-time members clustered in conversations that stopped when he approached, their body language suggesting discussions he wasn't meant to overhear. Newer families seemed uncertain about how to position themselves in relation to the obvious tension. The pastor's greatest concern was James Perkins himself. In 8 years of ministry at Cedar Creek, Pastor Henderson had learned to respect the older man's influence and dedication, but he had also observed James's tendency toward inflexibility when he felt his authority or principles were challenged. The morning's confrontation had clearly wounded James more deeply than a simple seating dispute should have, suggesting underlying issues that might require more careful attention than Pastor Henderson had initially realized. As the fellowship lunch progressed, the usual easy mingling of church members felt forced and artificial. Conversations that normally flowed naturally between different families and age groups became stilted exchanges between clearly defined camps. The Perkins family and their supporters occupied one section of the fellowship hall, while newer members gravitated toward another area, with long-time members who felt caught in the middle, attempting to maintain relationships with both groups. Young Michael Perkins, the 16-year-old grandson whose offer to confront the Daniels family had been quickly dismissed, watched the adult drama with the sharp observation of adolescence. He could see his grandfather's pain, his father's anger, his mother's embarrassment, and his aunt's confusion, but he could also see the obvious distress of the Daniels family and the general discomfort of everyone else in the church. "This is stupid," he whispered to his cousin David Coleman, Sarah's 12-year-old son. "It's just seats. Why is everyone acting like it's the end of the world?" The boy's assessment was both accurate and completely beside the point. It was just seats, but it was also about belonging, recognition, tradition, change, and the complex social dynamics that governed small-town life. The adults were fighting about much more than seating arrangements, but they lacked the vocabulary, or perhaps the courage to address the real issues directly. As the afternoon wore on, James Perkins found himself increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by family and supporters. The weight of the morning's events settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, and he began to contemplate actions that a few hours earlier would have seemed unthinkable. The church that had been his second home for nearly 7 decades suddenly felt foreign and unwelcoming. The community that had always acknowledged his contributions and respected his opinions now seemed indifferent to his concerns. The faith that had sustained him through decades of challenges felt somehow diminished by the casual dismissal of traditions he held sacred. Martha watched her husband's growing withdrawal with alarm. In 52 years of marriage, she had seen James angry, frustrated, and disappointed, but she had never seen him look quite so defeated. The man who had always found solutions to problems, who had always managed to navigate conflicts with determination and dignity, seemed genuinely lost in the face of changes he couldn't control or accept. As families began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave the fellowship hall, Pastor Henderson made one final attempt to address the morning's tensions. He approached the Perkins family with the hopeful expression of someone who believed that clear communication could resolve any misunderstanding. "James, Martha," Pastor Henderson said, "I was hoping we might sit down together this week and talk about how we can make sure everyone feels comfortable and welcome in our church family. Perhaps we could work out some kind of understanding that honors both tradition and growth." The offer was reasonable and well-intentioned, but it came too late and addressed the wrong problem. James was no longer interested in compromise or understanding. He was wounded, angry, and convinced that the fundamental character of his church was changing in ways that threatened everything he valued about faith, community, and tradition. "Pastor," James replied with icy politeness, "I think everyone's position has been made quite clear today. We'll see how things develop from here." The response was cordial enough to avoid open confrontation, but cold enough to signal that James considered the matter far from resolved. As the Perkins family gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, other church members watched with the uncomfortable awareness that something fundamental had shifted in their community dynamics. Outside the church, as families dispersed to their Sunday afternoon routines, the September sunshine felt mockingly cheerful after the morning's dark tensions. James Perkins stood beside his Buick, looking back at the white clapboard building that had been central to his life for nearly 70 years, and felt like he was seeing it with new eyes, eyes that recognized how much had already changed and how much more change might be coming. The drive home was silent except for the soft sound of Martha's occasional sighs. Neither husband nor wife spoke about what had happened or what might happen next, but both understood that this Sunday had marked the end of something important in their lives, and possibly the beginning of something they weren't sure they were prepared to face. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Tennessee hills, James Perkins sat in his kitchen, still wearing his Sunday best, and contemplated the unthinkable possibility that the church his family had helped build might no longer be the place where they belonged. The week following Rally Day passed with deceptive normalcy in Cedar Creek, but beneath the surface of routine farm work and everyday activities, the tensions from Sunday's incident continued to fester like an untreated wound. James Perkins went through the motions of his daily life, checking cattle, reviewing farm accounts, attending to the 100 small tasks that kept a working farm operational, but his mind remained fixed on the fundamental changes he perceived threatening his community. Martha watched her husband's brooding with growing alarm. In 52 years of marriage, she had seen James weather droughts, economic downturns, family tragedies, and countless other challenges that rural life presented. But the quiet intensity of his current preoccupation felt different, more dangerous somehow than his usual direct approach to solving problems. "James," she said on Wednesday evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the sun set behind the rolling hills, "maybe it's time to let Sunday go. People will forget about it if we don't keep picking at the wound." James turned to look at his wife with eyes that held a mixture of love and profound disappointment. "Martha, this isn't about Sunday. Sunday just showed us what's been happening to our church, our community, for months now. We've been losing ground inch by inch, and nobody seems to care as long as we're all polite about it." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of James's concerns, fears that went far beyond seating arrangements to fundamental questions about tradition, respect, and the direction their community was heading. He spoke about the subtle changes he had observed, new families forming their own social circles rather than integrating into established structures, younger members questioning decisions that had worked well for decades, Pastor Henderson's apparent preference for accommodating newcomers rather than supporting long-time families. "It's like we built something good and lasting," James said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated frustration. "And now we're being told it wasn't good enough, that we need to change everything to make room for people who don't understand or appreciate what we created." Martha understood her husband's feelings, even shared some of them, but she also recognized the danger in his increasingly rigid thinking. "Change isn't always bad, James. Maybe some of these new ideas could help the church grow stronger." "Stronger?" James's voice rose slightly, though he caught himself and looked around to ensure their conversation remained private. "How is it stronger when families can't count on basic traditions being respected? How is it stronger when people who've given their lives to building something are treated the same as folks who just wandered in last month?" The argument that followed was one of the most serious disagreements in their long marriage. Martha found herself defending positions she wasn't entirely sure she believed, while James articulated fears and resentments he had been nursing for months. Both recognized that they were really arguing about much larger issues than church seating, but neither seemed able to find common ground. Meanwhile, throughout Cedar Creek, the Sunday incident had become a topic of conversation that revealed deep divisions within the community. At Richardson's General Store, customers debated the incident in hushed tones while waiting for their purchases to be tallied. Some supported the Perkins family's position, arguing that long-time members deserved special consideration and that traditions should be respected. Others felt that the confrontation had been an embarrassing overreaction that made the church look unwelcoming to newcomers. The Daniels family found themselves in an impossible position. They had done nothing wrong, yet their presence had triggered a conflict that seemed to grow more serious with each passing day. Michael considered approaching James Perkins directly to apologize and perhaps arrange some kind of understanding. but Susan worried that such a gesture might be seen as an admission of guilt for something they hadn't intentionally done. "Maybe we should look for another church," Susan suggested during a Tuesday evening conversation that had become typical of their week. "There are other congregations in the county. We don't have to stay somewhere we're obviously not wanted." Michael understood his wife's reasoning, but something in him rebelled against the idea of being driven away by a conflict they hadn't created. "We were welcomed by Pastor Henderson and most of the congregation. Should we let one family's territorial feelings dictate where we worship?" The debate reflected a broader question about how communities handle change and conflict. Was the solution to avoid confrontation by accommodating the most vocal opposition, or was there value in standing firm on principles of equality and inclusion? Pastor Henderson spent the week attempting to address the growing tensions through individual conversations with key families, but his efforts seemed to create more problems than they solved. When he visited the Perkins farm on Thursday afternoon, hoping to find some basis for reconciliation, he discovered that James's position had hardened rather than softened over the course of the week. "Pastor," James said as they sat in the farm's kitchen, "I appreciate you coming by, but I think we need to be clear about something. This isn't a problem that's going to be solved by asking everyone to be more understanding. This is about fundamental principles, respect for tradition, recognition of service, and the basic courtesy that long-time members deserve." Pastor Henderson tried to explain his vision of a church community that could honor its past while embracing growth and change, but James seemed immune to appeals for compromise or flexibility. "You keep talking about change like it's automatically good," James replied. "But change can destroy as much as it builds. When we start treating everyone the same, regardless of their contributions or their commitment, we lose the very things that made this church worth belonging to in the first place." The conversation ended without resolution, leaving Pastor Henderson with the uncomfortable realization that the Sunday incident had revealed philosophical differences that might not be reconcilable through ordinary pastoral intervention. Robert Perkins spent the week rallying support among other longtime church families, discovering that many shared his father's concerns about the direction the church was heading. The conversations revealed long-simmering resentments about various changes that had occurred over recent months: new procedures for church committees, different approaches to fundraising, subtle shifts in worship style that reflected Pastor Henderson's efforts to appeal to younger families. "It's not just the seating thing," Harold Morrison confided during a conversation at the farm supply store. "It's the whole attitude that nothing we built matters anymore, that everything has to change to accommodate people who haven't earned their place yet." By Friday evening, James Perkins had made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a week earlier. After nearly 60 years of faithful attendance, he was considering staying home from Sunday worship, rather than subjecting his family to another confrontation, or, worse, quietly accepting a secondary role in the church he had helped build. Martha discovered her husband's intentions during a late evening conversation that began with practical questions about Sunday plans and escalated into the most serious crisis their marriage had faced in decades. "You're talking about abandoning everything you've worked for," Martha said, her voice mixing disbelief with desperation. 60 years of service, and you're going to throw it away because of where people sit." James tried to explain that his decision wasn't about seating, but about dignity, respect, and the principle that long-time commitment should carry some weight in community decisions. But even as he spoke the words, he could hear how they might sound to others: petty, rigid, and fundamentally un-Christian. "Maybe I am too old," James admitted in a moment of painful honesty. "Maybe the church needs to move in directions I don't understand or agree with. But I don't have to sit there and pretend to be happy about watching everything I valued get swept aside for the sake of change." The conversation continued past midnight, with Martha alternately pleading, reasoning and arguing with her husband about the consequences of his intended boycott. She pointed out that his absence would only confirm what some people already suspected, that the Perkins family's commitment was conditional on getting their own way. She reminded him of his responsibilities as a deacon, his influence on younger family members, and his obligations to the faith he claimed to honor. But James remained unmoved, or perhaps unable to move from the position his pride and principles had locked him into. "I've given this church the best years of my life," he said finally. "I've donated money we couldn't afford, time I needed for family and farm, and energy I should have saved for my own concerns. All I asked in return was basic respect for what we contributed. If that's too much to expect, then maybe it's time for someone else to carry the load." Saturday passed in an atmosphere of tense preparation, with the entire Perkins family aware that Sunday would bring another crisis, but uncertain about how it should be handled. Robert supported his father's position and was prepared to join any boycott or confrontation. Samuel remained torn between loyalty to his father and concern about the family's reputation in the community. Sarah worried about the impact on her children and the broader implications for their family's role in Cedar Creek society. The night before the second Sunday, James Perkins lay awake staring at the ceiling, wrestling with doubts that he couldn't quite suppress despite his public certainty. Was he defending important principles or simply indulging wounded pride? Was his contemplated absence a justified protest or an abandonment of Christian responsibility? The questions tormented him through the long hours before dawn, but they didn't change his fundamental conviction that something precious was being lost in the name of progress and inclusion. Sunday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early October, the kind of perfect autumn day that normally would have filled James with gratitude for God's creation and anticipation of worship with his church family. Instead, he felt hollow, disconnected from the familiar rhythms of Sunday preparation that had structured his weeks for most of his 73 years. At 8 o'clock, the time when the family usually began final preparations for church, James made the announcement that would define not just this Sunday, but the future of the Perkins family's relationship with First Baptist Church of Cedar Creek. "We're not going to church today," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger or defiance that might have been expected. "I've thought about this all week, and I can't sit in that sanctuary and pretend everything is fine when fundamental principles are being ignored." The reaction from his family was immediate and intense. Martha burst into tears, not the gentle weeping of sadness, but the harsh sobs of someone watching a disaster unfold. Robert demanded to know what exactly his father expected to accomplish with this dramatic gesture. Samuel pleaded for reconsideration, pointing out that absence would only make the situation worse. Sarah argued that punishing the entire church for Pastor Henderson's handling of one incident was both unfair and counterproductive, but James had reached a point where retreat felt impossible and compromise felt like surrender. "Sometimes," he said, addressing his family with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions, "a man has to take a stand on principle, even when it costs him something important. I've spent my whole life trying to do right by this church and this community. If that doesn't count for anything anymore, then maybe it's time for me to step back and let other people handle things their own way." The argument that followed was unlike anything the Perkins family had experienced in their collective memory. Voices were raised, accusations made, ultimatums delivered. Robert threatened to support his father regardless of the consequences. Samuel warned that the family's reputation in the community would be permanently damaged. Martha begged her husband to reconsider, reminding him of all the relationships and responsibilities his absence would affect. But James remained unmoved, perhaps because moving would require him to acknowledge that his position might be wrong, and admitting error at this point felt like betraying everything he had stood for throughout his adult life. As the morning progressed and the time for church service approached, the Perkins family found themselves facing a crisis that went far beyond Sunday worship attendance. They were confronting fundamental questions about loyalty, principle, community responsibility, and the price of standing firm on beliefs that others might not share or understand. At First Baptist Church of Cedar Creek, Pastor Henderson noticed the absence of the Perkins family immediately. The empty third-row pew, now unoccupied by anyone, seemed to reproach the entire congregation for their failure to resolve the previous week's tensions in a way that preserved church unity. The Daniels family, seeing the empty pew, felt a mixture of relief and guilt. They had hoped that time would ease the conflict their presence had inadvertently created, but the conspicuous absence of the church's most prominent family suggested that the situation had actually grown worse rather than better. Other congregation members noticed the missing family and drew their own conclusions about what the absence meant and who was responsible for the crisis that was clearly dividing their church community. Pastor Henderson faced the challenge of conducting worship while knowing that his congregation was wounded, divided, and uncertain about how to heal the rifts that had opened in their community. His sermon, hastily revised Saturday night to address themes of forgiveness and reconciliation, felt inadequate to the magnitude of the problems his church was facing. Meanwhile, at the Perkins farm, James sat in his kitchen still wearing work clothes instead of his Sunday suit, reading his Bible with the kind of intense concentration that suggested he was searching for answers to questions that went far beyond theological understanding. The silence of Sunday morning, normally filled with the sounds of family preparation for worship, felt heavy with possibility and consequence. Martha moved through the house like someone in a dream, unable to process the reality that for the first time in nearly 60 years, her family was absent from Sunday worship, not because of illness or emergency, but because of a choice that felt both principled and profoundly wrong. The phone began ringing at 10:30. Concerned church members wanting to know if the family was all right, supporters expressing solidarity with James's position, and critics questioning his Christian commitment. Each call forced the family to explain and defend decisions that felt more complicated and painful with every conversation. By afternoon, word of the Perkins family's church boycott had spread throughout Cedar Creek, creating exactly the kind of community-wide discussion that James had both wanted and dreaded. Some praised his willingness to stand up for traditional values and longtime members' rights. Others criticized his pride, his inflexibility, and his abandonment of Christian principles of forgiveness and humility. The incident had evolved from a simple seating dispute into a comprehensive test of how a small community handles change, honors tradition, resolves conflict, and maintains unity when fundamental values seem to be in tension. As Sunday evening approached, James Perkins found himself in the position he had sought. Having made a clear statement about his principles and the importance of respecting established traditions and long-time commitments. But the victory felt hollow, costly and uncertain in its ultimate consequences. The church he loved was wounded, his family was divided, his community was talking, and his own heart was troubled by doubts he couldn't entirely suppress. The question that remained was whether his principled stand would ultimately strengthen the things he valued or contribute to their destruction. The sun set on Cedar Creek that Sunday evening with more questions than answers, more division than unity, and the uncomfortable awareness that some conflicts resist easy resolution regardless of how much goodwill and Christian charity people bring to the effort.